You were taught that money was invented to make trade easier, that it saved us from awkward bartering and helped civilization move forward. But what if that story is backwards? What if money wasn't created for convenience but for control, where money, power, and history collide? Because once you look closely at where money really came from, you realize it was never neutral, and it never stopped shaping who controls value, labor, and force. Most people learn a simple origin story about money. Early humans, we're told, relied on barter. A farmer had grain but needed shoes. A shoemaker had shoes but wanted meat. Trade was slow, inefficient, and awkward. Then someone had a breakthrough idea. Money. Coins appeared, trade improved, and society advanced. It's a neat story, logical, comforting, and largely false. Money didn't arise because barter failed. It arose because power needed a tool. And once that tool existed, it never stopped shaping who controlled value, labor, and violence. Before money, most human societies didn't function through barter at all. Inside small communities, people rarely negotiated exact exchanges. They relied on trust, memory, and obligation. You gave because you belonged. You received because you were known. Debts weren't written down. They were remembered. Value wasn't abstract. It was social. This system worked remarkably well, as long as societies remained small. But scale changes everything. As populations expanded, villages became cities. Trade extended beyond family and neighbors. Strangers arrived with no shared history and no mutual trust. Memory stopped working. Obligation weakened. Conflict became more common. Rulers faced a problem barter could never solve. How do you feed an army that doesn't know you? How do you tax people you'll never meet again? How do you extract value from a population spread across vast territory? That's where money enters the story, not as convenience, but as infrastructure. For value to move across distance, it needed a physical form, something durable, portable, divisible, something that could be counted without conversation and trusted without memory. Food spoiled. Livestock wandered. Land couldn't move. Labor vanished the moment it was used. Metal solved the problem. Copper, bronze, and silver weren't chosen because they were beautiful. They were chosen because they performed well under pressure. They didn't rot. They could be melted and reshaped. They could be divided precisely. They were scarce enough to matter, but common enough to circulate. Metal didn't just store value. It made value mobile, but it wasn't merchants who turned metal into money. It was rulers. Early states in Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the eastern Mediterranean didn't need money to trade. They needed money to command. Armies don't fight on promises. Soldiers don't march on goodwill. They need payment, standardized, recognizable, enforceable. Metal made that possible. Once states demanded taxes payable in metal, everything changed. People who once lived largely outside markets were forced into them. Subsistence became obligation. Harvests became liabilities. To obtain metal, peasants had to sell their goods, their labor, or their time. Markets didn't emerge naturally. They were pulled into existence by taxation and authority. Money didn't free people from rulers. It made rulers vastly more efficient. This is the part of monetary history rarely taught. Money wasn't neutral. It wasn't created to help equals trade smoothly. It was built to measure, extract, and redeploy value at scale. Once value could be extracted, it could be stored. Once stored, it could be accumulated. Once accumulated, it could be converted into force. That's why the earliest financial centers weren't marketplaces. They were temples and palaces. Priests and kings tracked grain, metal, and labor long before free markets existed. Accounting came before coinage. Ledgers came before markets. The system was built from the top down, not the bottom up. Then came the next leap. Metal was useful. Stamped metal was revolutionary. When states began minting coins, marking metal, with official symbols and authority, they weren't just standardizing trade. They were standardizing trust. A coin delivered a powerful message. You don't need to trust the person holding it. You only need to trust whoever stamped it. Authority replaced relationship. In Lydia, in Greek city-states, and later in Rome, coins carried faces, gods, and emblems of power. They weren't just economic tools. They were political messages. Every transaction reinforced who ruled. Every payment reminded people whose system they lived inside. Once rulers realized this, temptation followed. If you control money, you control how much exists. You control its purity. You control its circulation. Early governments learned they could stretch resources by reducing metal content, clipping edges, or issuing more coins than reserves justified. Spending became easier. Consequences were delayed. Inflation wasn't discovered in modern times. It was invented the moment money became adjustable. Prices rose, trust weakened, soldiers demanded higher pay, markets adapted, and yet the system endured. Because once money existed, societies couldn't abandon it. The tool was too powerful, too embedded. Money didn't evolve away from power, it evolved with it. The bronze coins of ancient empires are gone, but the logic they created remains. We still use standardized units. We still rely on authority to define value. We still accept abstraction instead of trust. The materials changed. The incentives didn't. Once metal became money, societies crossed a line they could never uncross. Money didn't just measure value. It reorganized behavior. Stored value made power patient. Armies could be raised before wars began. Bureaucracies could grow during peace. Control no longer required constant force. And patience is power. This is why monetary systems outlast rulers. Kings fall. Dynasties collapse. Borders shift. But money quietly absorbs new symbols while preserving the same structure underneath. Coins once carried gods, then emperors, later national emblems. The imagery changed, the message didn't. As economies expanded, money spread far beyond its original purpose. What began as a way to pay soldiers became the backbone of trade, debt, and hierarchy. Wealth could accumulate across generations. Debt could be enforced. Inequality could persist long after its original cause vanished. Money stopped being a tool and became an environment. By the height of empires like Rome, money felt natural, invisible, inevitable. When pressure mounted, rulers rarely questioned the system. They adjusted it. Debasement wasn't ignorance, it was constraint. Wars were expensive, administrations demanded payment. Raising taxes risked revolt. So value was diluted quietly. A little less silver, a few more coins. The effects arrived slowly. Inflation crept in, trust eroded. By the time people felt it, the decision makers were gone. Nothing says stability like solving today's problems by borrowing from tomorrow. Sound familiar? Modern money may no longer jingle in pockets, but it still carries ancient DNA. Today's currencies aren't backed by metal. They're backed by authority, obligation, and enforcement. Taxes are still due. Debts still payable. Armies still funded. The language evolved. Debasement became liquidity. Clipped coins became balance sheets. Emperors became institutions. But the mechanism stayed the same. Money isn't evil, it's human. The mistake is assuming it evolved to be fair. It didn't. It evolved to scale. Fairness has always been negotiated. after the fact through politics, pressure, and resistance. Understanding this changes how you see inflation, debt, and financial crises. These aren't glitches. They're features of a system designed to manage large populations and large power imbalances. When stress rises, the system bends, sometimes quietly, sometimes violently, but never randomly. That's why financial education grounded in history matters. Not to predict the next collapse, but to understand the limits of the system you're living inside. Real financial freedom doesn't come from rejecting money. It comes from understanding what money was built to do and what it was never meant to provide. Money can move value, store labor, coordinate massive systems. But it can't replace judgment. It can't guarantee fairness. It can't protect those who mistake structure for security. From barter to bronze, from coins to code. The logic remains the same. Money didn't emerge to make life easier. It emerged to make power portable. And once power became portable, it reshaped everything. The most dangerous belief isn't that money is corrupt. It's that money is neutral. History doesn't repeat, but the logic it runs on rarely changes. Once you see that logic clearly, you stop asking why the system behaves the way it does and start asking a better question. Where do I stand inside it? If this changed how you see money, subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.